Now that we've covered that section in our notes, then you can start in writing your student-generated test. Ultimately, you're going to make a test that has 10 questions on it, and someone else in the class is going to take that, and then you're going to grade it and give them some feedback. Right now, we've only covered enough concepts for you to write 2 questions. The first question is going to be about this topic, which was on page 1 of your notes, and this topic, which started on page 2 of your notes. Let's talk about some criteria for whenever you go to write these 2 test questions. First of all, for every question, all 10 questions, you have to provide some kind of diagram that the test taker has to analyze in order to answer that question correctly. For that to be more clear, let me give you some examples of some questions that don't do this. That even though you put a diagram on there, it's common knowledge and anyone can answer that without analyzing a diagram. So here's a question that I've seen in the past. It says, what do you call the movement of water? And I'll have students draw a membrane and they'll have water on one side and water's moving. And sometimes they even label this. They say osmosis. And their question is, what do you call the movement of water? Well, the answer is osmosis. But that's common knowledge. I could open up the door and yell across the hall to Miss Dace, or she could do the same to me, and say, hey, what's the movement of water? And I don't have to look at a diagram to know that. The answer is osmosis. So even though you included a diagram, the question didn't make me analyze the diagram to come up with the correct answer. Here's another example of a bad question. What part of the phospholipid is hydrophobic? Well, you can answer that question right now. We just covered it. So the part of the phospholipid that's hydrophobic would be the tails. So I don't have to look at the diagram to answer that question. So even though you include a diagram, it's a bad question because it's not really about the diagram. Or I do not have to analyze the diagram, at least to answer it. Another limitation related to diagrams is you cannot use any diagrams directly out of your notes. You need to come up with your own diagrams, or the easiest way to come up with diagrams is Google things like cell membrane structure, fluid mosaic model, image of the cell membrane, and you're going to see lots of pictures and lots of diagrams that are simple that you can draw as well. You can label different parts like A, B, C, and D, and you can ask different questions related to this first and this second topic. So use diagrams and use Google to get some of those diagrams, but you can't use anything directly out of your notes. And you're more than welcome to come up with your own diagrams that are different from the ones that are in your notes. The second thing we're going to look at is clarity. Will a test taker understand what it is that you're trying to ask them? So one thing to keep in mind is whenever you're writing a question, is there really only 1 or 2 possible right answers to this question? If you ask a question and it's very open-ended, you're going to get all kinds of answers, and they might not be anywhere near what you were expecting or what you would assume that someone put down for that answer. And that person could argue that technically they're correct because you just didn't have a very clear question. For example, I read a question today and I said, well, let me answer it because I think this is what you want. And I said, I'm going to write polar right here. Is that what you would put down for your answer? And he said, no. And I said, well, you need to clarify your question. Where do you want me to write down polar and nonpolar? Because where I was writing polar and nonpolar, he was wanting me to label things like transmembrane proteins and peripheral proteins and stuff like that. So something else that will help with clarity is giving places where students are supposed to put their answers. Leaving lines or leaving boxes and say in the text box, diagram or show. Also, something that's kind of easy to do is have your test taker use colors. Shade in the part of the diagram that is with yellow. And in addition, when you're writing test questions, sometimes it helps if you add color. So then in your question, you can say, after analyzing the yellow parts of the diagram, answer the following questions. So it can be very helpful if you add color to your diagram as you're writing these test questions. C talks about the subject. You have 10 questions. Question 1 should be about this topic. Question 2 is going to be about this topic. Question 3 is going to be about this topic. I caught a student in the middle of writing question number 1, and he was diagramming DNA, which had absolutely nothing to do with what he should have been asking about. So make sure you look at the topic and your questions identify the whole area of the topic. So for your first question, just don't ask about phospholipids and about their polar and nonpolar properties. You also are responsible for determining if this person knows integral proteins and transmembrane proteins and what part of them would be polar and what part of them would be nonpolar, and that the phospholipids and arrange themselves into this phospholipid bilayer. So if you need to, question 1, part A can be about phospholipids, part B can be about different proteins, part C can even be about polar and nonpolar. So to make or to cover the full topic, feel free to do part A and part B and part C and so on for these different questions. D is we're talking about difficulty. And we want your questions to be challenging, not too challenging, but we don't want them to be elementary. Let me give you an example of an elementary question as of this point. Label the tails of the phospholipid. I could probably go to 90% of the freshmen in this building, and if I say, what would be the tails of the phospholipid, they would point right at the tails, and they've never had this information before. That question is too elementary. If you asked what would be the head of the phospholipid, then this would probably be too easy as well, because they'd probably point to the circles, because they think of the head as being circular, like we see in the phospholipids there. So that would be an example of a question that is simply too elementary. And then finally, on the back of this sheet is where you're going to put your answers. So we're going to make sure you have your answer key filled out, and this will be to your advantage because you're going to write a test question this week, and you might not be grading this until 3 weeks from now, and you maybe would have forgotten exactly what you were looking for. So fill out that answer key as you're writing those questions, and this is where the answers are going to go. Your questions are just going to be on notebook paper. So when you're filling it out on notebook paper, your test questions, remember that you're going to hand these papers to another student, and they're going to take your test right there on your notebook paper. So again, make sure you're leaving space for them to write down different answers for your questions. To get you started, I want you to get out a piece of notebook paper, and 1 is fine to start with. In the upper right-hand corner, I want you to write written by and your name. And then underneath that, I want you to put taken by, and eventually someone is going to write their name in there whenever they take your completed test. Going back to this front page, again, your first question is going to be about phospholipids, integral proteins, transmembrane proteins, and so on, why they're arranged the way that they're arranged. And again, this has to do with polar and nonpolar properties of these molecules. Your second question or questions are going to be about those 4 types of proteins that we discussed on page 2. Can they recognize transport proteins, receptor proteins, and so on? Again, each question has to be about a diagram. So you have to Google some images, so Google receptor proteins and transport proteins, and look at different ways you can diagram them, and then ask questions about the specific diagrams that you put in your test questions. I want to emphasize that whenever you're asking questions about different types of proteins, you need to show some kind of action. Because when I take a look at this diagram, and the question I got from a student, and this was the diagram that they gave me, was label this. Well, that is a meatball sub sandwich. And you probably can't really argue with me because most of you looked at it and thought it was a meatball sub sandwich as well. I can't really tell that this is a transport protein until you show me some action. A simple arrow would have identified that this was a transport protein and not some s'mores with 3 marshmallows in it. Again, you have to give me some defining characteristics. You can't just draw a protein and expect me to know that's an enzymatic protein. I have to show substrates coming in and products coming out for me to identify that that protein that you diagrammed is an enzyme. Also remember, just don't ask about one type of protein. We want to make sure that they can identify and tell us a little bit about receptors, enzymes, transports, and marker proteins. And again, that had to relate to this second topic, the different types of proteins that can be embedded in the membrane.